crap! Was that a flyby?
On the 16th of July, the last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet was damaged. A perfect congratulations on the GER and SBU for Russian Navy Day.
It's listing quite heavily.
It's heading this way. Look, what a huge ship. Attacks have begun on the Northern Pacific and Black Sea fleets of Russia. The SBU and the armed forces of Ukraine are attacking military airfields, nuclear submarines, and the Russian Navy. Everything's on fire!
Even the ocean is sinking for now. There it goes again, look.
An oil depot. No Russian naval fleet can effectively hide from Malyuk's advanced naval drones and the SBU. We'll discuss all this with military analyst Roman Svitan right now. Holy crap! Was that a flyby?
Breaking news, friends. A reason for the SBU and our special services to attack Russian military targets. Here's the most interesting news. The last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet has been damaged. A source in the main intelligence directorate claims that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has only one submarine left, the Kolpino. It was the only submarine capable of carrying out combat missions, and now it has been damaged. According to the main intelligence directorate, a military airfield was attacked last night, and the Buturlinovka airbase was also targeted. The 899th Guards Assault Aviation Orsha Regiment For several days in a row, the Ukrainian armed forces have been attacking military factories in Russia. This time, the Tambov powder plant in the city of Kotovsk was hit.
Damn, I can't keep up.
Everything is on fire.
Maybe it's the plant? The plant? Take a look at what's going on there. We're screwed.
Last night, the permanent deployment point of Russian militants in Marino-Kursk region was attacked. There was a permanent deployment point of one of the Russian airborne forces units. The number is about a compass. The SBU and special services are preparing attacks on the Pacific Fleet and the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation. The Washington Post published an article saying that the SBU and Ukrainian special services will continue their special operations. Let's discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish good health.
Important information about the submarines of the Black Sea Fleet. Here is the Kolpino, which for some reason is now reported as damaged by the main intelligence directorate.
Damage. The Russians have 3 submarines left in the Black Sea, so-called launchers, which can launch caliber missiles from underwater. So if it's damaged, there really is that. Why? Because the general staff hasn't confirmed it yet. So right now we're talking based on information from a Telegram channel. Once the general staff confirms it, then we can say that another caliber carrier can be counted as a loss. Well, a submarine can be damaged in various ways in principle. If it's reconnaissance, that means either informants or external influence, that is using UUVs or underwater torpedo device. We actually have so-called underwater drones like the Toloka and the Marichka that carry out combat missions. And of course, there's also the possibility of targeting them when they surface. That is submarines approach, for example, Novorossiysk. They have specific docks and technical services there, and damage could be inflicted there as well. That's why, of course, this is very important for us. For example, damaging the submarines themselves, submarines, because in the Black Sea at the moment, we can't really track them properly. So while we can see Russian surface ships well, if a submarine goes deep, it becomes very difficult. It is possible in principle, but for that you need entire air operations, by the way, including the use of special hydrobuoys, in other words, certain means to detect the submarine. Sinking it is also very difficult, so the optimal way is to damage it while it's on the surface, and even better in the area of Novorossiysk. Why has Novorossiysk been waiting for our army's actions for so long? The intelligence services seem to have forgotten about it, about the Novorossiysk direction, most likely because there's an oil terminal nearby. And right now, the intelligence services are as afraid of any Russian oil facilities as they are of fire. In fact, Ukrainian intelligence services are quicker to steer clear of oil facilities than the Russians themselves. So now, of course, the question is for our army, that is, our armed forces of Ukraine are not as tightly tied to certain power structures as the intelligence services are. They mostly just do the dirty work for them. But the army is already carrying out combat missions and understands for itself that if they don't destroy, say, Russian submarines in Novorossiysk, naturally, if they hit the oil terminal in Novorossiysk as well, then in the end, they'll be the ones who have to die. The intelligence services aren't the ones dying. It's the soldier who dies on the front line of combat, while the intelligence services, instead of destroying hydrocarbon targets under Maliuk and Budanov sanctions, just throw up their hands and say, oh dear, oh no, we can't, we weren't able to, and so on and so forth. That's why the military now has to take on this task, the destruction of Russian hydrocarbon infrastructure, including the bases of Russian submarines. There are just too many questions. They are not fulfilling their direct official duties. Destroying Russian military targets is the main task of the armed forces of Ukraine. That's the army's job. In fact, to be honest, right now, this is Magyar's main task: use long-range strike capabilities, mainly drones, to destroy, including the enemy's rear positions, and the special services should be dealing with internal problems, and we have more than enough of them. They received an order not to strike Russian oil and gas infrastructure. Of course, thank you very much for having supported the armed forces of Ukraine at the time. But in the end, we also need to deal with internal enemies and internal issues. That's regarding the special service. And as for Magyar, believe me, he'll handle it. I think Magyar would send anyone who orders him not to strike a military target, such as, for example, the oil and gas sector of Russia itself, in the same direction as the Russian warship. Of course, they'll come up with something for the 12th offer congratulations. But right now, I would already, after the special services have shown themselves in a very bad light, because they failed to fulfill their direct duties. They didn't arrest those in contact with the Russians. They didn't arrest the person who gave the order not to strike Russian oil refineries. In other words, they failed in their task. So let the special services deal with the army, since they've already shifted into the mode of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, meaning they've moved closer to that old, still Soviet school. Then at least let the armed forces of Ukraine do their job now. All the more so, it's long past time for the special services to, let's put it mildly, change their focus. The main intelligence directorate should not be subordinate to the Minister of Defense, especially not a civilian one. The main intelligence directorate should be subordinate to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and within it should be the same special operations forces. In other words, this is a unified system, and what should they be doing there? Destroying Russian military targets, including those in their oil refining sector. The security service of Ukraine also should no longer exist. Why? Because, for example, engaging in political investigations for those in power, so-called elites, we don't need that. After all, we are a democratic country, a European one. That's why all these KGB-style habits need to be reduced to zero, those habits. And the released political investigators from the SBU should be sent to the armed forces of Ukraine, to the infantry. That would be the optimal solution. The only structure that should remain operational, truly operational, is counterintelligence. But again, counterintelligence should be placed under the General Staff, that is under the command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. This will be the main intelligence directorate, which will also include counterintelligence. That's it. We shouldn't have a GER under the Ministry of Defense, nor should we have the SB. In other words, it simply shouldn't exist. The army should be focused on combat tasks, that is systematic work to destroy the Russian military economy and Russian military facilities. This is the optimal solution for us. Right now, we can't afford to support intelligence agencies that, to put it mildly, aren't catching any mice inside the country.
Roman Grigorievich, the Buturinovka airfield has been attacked. The 899th Guards Assault Aviation Orsha Regiment. There have been explosions, there is damage. Let's discuss this.
Well, it's an assault regiment. So there are Su aircraft stationed there. Russian Su aircraft, a large number of them. We've hit Buturinovka several times, but we haven't completely taken it out. Well, in principle, it's practically impossible to completely take out any airfield unless you have the ability to get to the runway, say with bombers, and drop free-fall bombs, mainly concrete piercing ones, with pretty good, really good bombing accuracy. If that's not possible, then at most you can damage, especially if it's drones, the airfield's technical equipment, and any vehicles present, including Russian aircraft. I think that within a couple of days, the general staff, after decoding operational control data and analyzing satellite images obtained by our intelligence, will report the actual losses. But Buturlinovka is one of the tactical aviation airfields that will be destroyed whenever possible at the very least. The only thing is, of course, they now realize that we are starting to reach such distances, so they will begin to disperse their tactical aviation. Attack aircraft are tactical aviation.
Roman Grigorievich, we've just noticed that we are intensively attacking military airfields and in general facilities of Russia's military industrial complex. Just in the last 15 days, one military space reconnaissance unit was attacked, 3 airfields, 13 enterprises connected to the military industrial complex. An additional 4 were attacked again within the month, and 3 more airfields. The focus is on chemical plants and ammunition production. How do you assess the work undoubtedly over these last 2 weeks?
And here we can actually praise our army, because the majority of these strikes are the work of our own troops, the armed forces of Ukraine, mainly that is, the drone forces, the air forces are involved, and the Navy naval fleet. So in this sense, they have their own boats. Right now, Magyar has proven himself very well in commanding the drone forces. In other words, there is a certain amount of work being done within the command system. This is all, in fact, the systematic work of the army which targets military facilities. And here it's very important, the word systematic. Systematic work. Why? Because the special services swoop in, peck at something, run off, peck at something else, show off a bit, and then run off again. But the army, if it takes on something, it does it slowly, will come down from the mountain and take the entire Russian herd. That's how the army works. Why is this actually optimal? Because when you have fully formed armed forces, they don't need anyone else at all. Within the armed forces, there should be their own special services, which must carry out combat missions according to the combat charter and the oaths that servicemen and officers at the very least give to the people of Ukraine, and not listen to politicians who tie the hands of the special service. But the special services, like little lapdogs, run errands for the politicians. The army doesn't work like that. The army itself within its own ranks can clean itself up thoroughly and even twist the heads of politicians who are working for the enemy. So this was actually a precise operation, the destruction of powder factories, the destruction of airfields, aircraft on the airfields, the destruction of production facilities, especially electronics. So in just a couple of weeks, probably about a dozen and a half, as we discuss almost every other day, about a dozen and a half major significant Russian targets have been destroyed. The only thing left now is to continue not with Maluk or Budanov sanctions. Forget about Maluk and Budanov because of the sanctions. They will no longer be working on oil refineries. We need to continue destroying the Russian hydrocarbon industry using the capabilities of unmanned systems. This opportunity exists, and Magyar needs to prove himself. If even Magyar ends up selling out like the intelligence services, then I guess it'll be up to the old guys to take care of this, gather their friends, and just burn down the Russian hydrocarbon industry from the inside, so to speak, from within Russia.
Dear audience, please like this video. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine and let us know where you're watching. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Ukraine. That's why every like, every comment, and every subscription is priceless. I'm grateful to you for that. Roman Grigorievich, last night and actually for several days in a row, we've been attacking military factories in Russia. And right now, the Tambov powder plant in the city of Kotovsk is under attack. What have we analyzed? So the Tambov powder plant produces nitrocellulose powders for all types of small arms and artillery weapons, including systems of various calibers used by ground forces, the Navy, and aviation. It is also the main supplier of armor-piercing sub-caliber rounds for tank artillery. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours.
Any powder plant is very difficult to hit and completely put out of commission. Well, at least it's practically impossible to do so with drones. So the fact that we managed to hit the Tambov powder plant today, well, it's good that we hit it. But in reality, we didn't inflict any significant damage. Why is that? Because some of the workshops are underground. Any powder plant, when it was designed back in the Soviet Union, was supposed to withstand the nuclear strike. How is any drone supposed to reach it? The only way to hit a powder plant is with a warhead weighing about half a ton, a tandem one, meaning you have to break open the underground chambers, get inside to where the gunpowder is actually produced, and detonate it there. This is only possible with the use of either cruise missiles of long or very long range, and at the moment we don't have any of those. Even if the Taurus missiles are supplied, at the level of the Taurus, Storm Shadow, or Scalpwell, South Carolina ALP has a range of 250 kilometers, Taurus 500 kilometers. We won't be able to reach all the factories, and most of the Russian powder factories are closer to the Urals. That's already almost 2,000 kilometers away. Right now, what is especially important for us is ballistics. In other words, we need a ballistic missile program. And if it hasn't been launched yet, then the executive branch, which has been sitting on this for 7 years and still hasn't started, it needs to be kicked into action. Ballistics means not just being able to hit targets 50 or 100 kilometers away, like the Toshka-U or the HIMARS systems with their M30 and M31 rockets, but being able to strike 2,500 kilometers away to reach the Urals. That's what we're talking about. These are serious ballistic missile programs which were ruined back in Poroshenko's time and then buried even deeper by the current government. So at this point, the executive branch has been in power for 7 years, and we still don't have a single ballistic missile. Meanwhile, during this time, the Saudis used our facilities and their own money to produce the Chrome missiles and took them for themselves. So the capability exists, which means there was simply no will and no funding allocated for this program. And this, in its purest form during combat operations, is Article 111 state treason. Why are all these people still not behind bars? Again, these are questions for the security services who are busy with God knows what, but not their actual job. So this is a major problem for us right now. But I think the security services will listen to us and finally start doing their job by identifying the shortcomings in the planning of the ballistic programs production. Why? Because without ballistics, we definitely won't win this war. And what's more, the most interesting thing is that the best air defense for us right now is ballistic missiles, as strange as that may sound. Because any strike on our territory, if we respond with a ballistic missile aimed at Moscow, at the Kremlin, and it's only 500 kilometers away, we don't need to reach the Urals. It's just 500 kilometers so far. It's basically 5 to 10 minutes of flight time for a ballistic missile. And this is the optimal option, but all our authorities in recent times have simply ruined it. They just didn't allow us to strike Moscow in response to attacks on Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, basically anywhere in Ukraine. So there's a big question here. I'll say it again, of course, there are no questions for the special services. They should be sent to the Ukrainian armed forces. That's already a lost cause for them. They're useless. But the question is for the executive authorities, because if we don't replace the executive authorities now, we'll never have ballistic missiles at all. And we'll fight to the last Ukrainian if we don't strike Moscow and don't destroy Russia's hydrocarbon industry. The best sanction is precisely the direct destruction of Russian oil refineries, Russian terminals, and Russia's gas and oil extraction industry. So this approach should be important, because here's a good point. We talk about ETs, we reach Tambov. Yes, we set off some kind of fireworks there. Did we destroy the plant? Number. Then what was the point of doing all that in the first place? Why waste drones that made it there, losing a whole bunch of drones and decoys on the way to Tambov? So why do it? Maybe it would have been easier to just hit Novoshaktinsk, the Russian oil refinery in Novoshaktinsk, which specifically supplies diesel, gasoline, and aviation kerosene to the Russian army. This is the question. It's just about showing off. But this kind of showing off is useless at this point. Either this government will work directly for Ukraine's victory, or it can go the same way as the previous Yanukovych government. They're sitting comfortably in Moscow, bad-mouthing each other. That is, Yanukovych probably dragged some of them along with him to Barvika or wherever they're staying. In other words, they can't do it. You can't do it. And I'm addressing the executive branch right now. You can't do it. You can clear the track, for goodness sake. If you don't have the brains to carry out certain tasks, to set them, supervise them, and deliver what we need, then clear the track. Let people who actually understand these matters come in. Why? Because otherwise we'll all end up badly, not just those in power. Sure, the authorities will grab the harden Netzel to speak ill-gotten gains and scatter in all directions. Ukraine will be lost and Ukrainians will disappear. Because if we keep operating like this, if we don't strike where we need to strike, then we simply won't exist anymore. We'll just wear ourselves down in this sense. And the blame for this will lie with the executive branch, which will scatter in all directions. So the question now is for the authorities, specifically for those people who are directly responsible for these issues. And as for Tambov getting a little scorched over there, well, that's just scaring the crows, at least for now. There were strikes before this. As we discussed before, there was a good strike on the fuel and lubricants depot in Engels. Almost the entire depot burned down. The only thing left there are the underground reservoirs. Several tens of thousands of tons of fuel, aviation kerosene, the so-called Russian depot. It would be good to get to those, but again, you can only reach them either with intelligence service confidants or with ballistic missiles, because those caissons are located in karst caves, and you can't just get to them easy, although of course you could try.
Roman Grigorievich, when we attacked the Iskander ballistic missile launchers in Bryansk, afterwards I read that many military analysts wrote, and there were even video materials saying that in this way Ukraine was testing or trying out our ballistic missiles, and that a number of airfields were attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. These were tests, and among other things, these launchers could have been attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. What do you think about this kind of information?
I think it's complete nonsense. Let me explain why. For several weeks now, we've been tearing into this executive branch left and right with 6-story curses, because in the 7th year, they still don't have any ballistic missiles. And most likely they threw this into the information stream like, no, we did something here ourselves. That's exactly what I'm talking about. What are Klinci? It's 50 kilometers from our border. What kind of ballistic missile do we need for that? Klinci is 50 kilometers away. An M31 rocket launched from a HIMARS can reach there. Ballistics, well, you could call it ballistics, no question about it. But what we need is a ballistic missile with a range of 500 kilometers to reach Moscow and a warhead of half a ton, not the kind of warhead that exploded in Klinci. We saw that information stream ourselves. There was no more than 50 kilograms of explosives there. So that's about a 90 kilogram warhead. So all that's exactly the M31 missile. What kind of ballistics do we have? Well, if you consider that the Iskander Sori, Hawaii Mars are ours, and the M31 missiles are already ours if we've paid for them, yes, no question, that's our ballistics produced in America. That's why there are serious questions for the executive branch, especially when they try to pull the wool over our eyes, claiming they've already tested something somewhere. If they had actually tested a real ballistic missile, only in the configuration I'm talking about, a half-ton warhead with a 500-kilometer range, Moscow would already be burning. We would have already seen it. Lenin would be running around Red Square in his underwear and a t-shirt, completely shocked, shouting, "What are you doing, for God's sake? Have you lost your minds?" But that's just not the case. So all this talk, this performance by our authorities about supposedly testing something somewhere, they can only test something in their own bathtub by doing certain things. That's it. They can't do anything else. It's obvious their complete impotence.
Roman Grigorievich, the permanent deployment point of Russian militants in Marino, Kursk region, was attacked. Military analysts report that the permanent deployment point of one of the Russian airborne forces units, about a company in size, is or was located there. We are expecting good news in the General Staff's report. What do you think?
Well, the permanent deployment points of Russian paratroopers right now, by the way, there are some pretty serious battles going on in Turpan. Mostly it's either Crimean paratroopers or those from Ivanovo. Basically, they took all the men from Ivanovo, the city of brides, and told them, you're going to be paratroopers. And all the girls from Ivanovo have already ended up in the LGBT community. What else are they supposed to do if there are no men left? So naturally, the permanent deployment point, which is not far from Tyotkino, that's risked as well. We've talked a lot about these strikes. Mainly Risk, Lovdis is the right bank of the center operating there. They were working around Marinka as well. It's the same thing. Recently, a bridge not far from Tyotkino was taken out just last night. So there's some serious work going on there, military work aimed at destroying the enemy's rear position. That's what they call the army's rear. In other words, either troop concentration areas or headquarters, command and control systems are being identified and tracked, and you can see systematic work being done there as well. In the Kursk direction right now, all branches and types of troops are clearly being used, probably except for the Navy. Although if there are Marines there, then most likely the Navy is involved too. So all branches and types of troops are specifically operating in the Kursk direction, and this systematic approach is producing results. Starting from the destruction of headquarters with a large number of Russians taken out, and recently, as we discussed, the Russian Su-35 was shot down. This also happened in the same area. This is, so to speak, the full range of combat tasks being carried out by the armed forces of Ukraine. You could say it's already possible to say that the summer of 2025 is the summer of formation. Uhin its full capacity for the Ukrainian army. Now, in full, well, the only thing we don't have at the moment, the only thing is space capabilities. That is, we don't have what are called space forces, although I think that will also come in due time because we have practically everything from submarines to aviation.
Kirill Budanov stated that the cooperation between Russia and North Korea is already having a direct impact on the war in Ukraine. In particular, the head of the GOR emphasized that Pyongyang is actively supplying Moscow with weapons, including artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. As an example of such cooperation, Budanov cited the North Korean ballistic missiles KN-23 or HN-23. He noted that the first batch of these missiles used against Ukraine was of extremely poor quality, almost half exploded in the air or veered significantly off target. However, thanks to assistance from the Russians, these missiles have been greatly improved. This is a direct result of the joint work of specialists from both regimes. And accordingly, this causes great concern, Budanov said. Roman Grigorievich, please.
Budanov is absolutely right. At first, the task for the KN-23, the Korean missile, was simply to hit the planet. But they couldn't even accomplish that. They exploded in the air, they couldn't even hit the planet. And then when they started bringing these missiles into our theater of military operations, most likely Chinese and Russian engineers got involved and perfected the missile. Right now, it's on par with the Iskander, maybe even has a bit more range, and models can go up to 200 kilometers farther than the Iskander, up to 700 kilometers. Some variants also have a warhead that's 150 kilograms heavier. So basically, the missile has become quite dangerous now, especially after skilled specialists got involved in its production, and they only got involved in the production of this missile just a few months ago, or, well, let's say last year. Meanwhile, our authorities have been sitting around for 7 years and still can't manage to create this missile. Especially considering that we had already developed it before, the very least, we should be able to recreate. I mean, even the same Rome, 2 missiles that we had and handed over to the Saudis, they can't even manage that. Look at the North Korean donuts, they don't even finish eating them, probably because they give the rest to Kim Jong-il, since he's not going to last much longer. But seriously, they really can't do it. They don't participate in the world economy at all. They're completely isolated by sanctions. Nevertheless, these are ballistic missiles capable of reaching, if we had them, all the way to Moscow, and that's 700 kilos. Moscow is 450 kilometers away, and these can go about 600 or 700 kilometers. So they managed to do it. In other words, the North Korean donut was able to make these missiles. But our Minister of Defense, our donut, couldn't make these missiles. So they seem pretty much the same, one just a bit wider than the other, but one has missiles and we don't. That's a big problem. So in this sense, Budanov is right in the sense that he provides accurate information. Yeah, but what's the use of that information? It doesn't really make any difference to us, that information itself. If Budanov were saying right now that the missile production in North Korea had been destroyed, now that would really be something, that would be a real achievement. So the point isn't about Budanov, it's about a systemic error, our systemic error in building up the armed forces. It shouldn't be like this, where we have about a dozen security agencies, a dozen of them, and they're all just drifting around, each doing their own thing. During wartime, everyone should be under unified command. The GUR should be under the command not of our donut, but under the chief of the general staff. It should ultimately be under NATO's command. And then we won't have to listen to Budanov at all. Frankly, we shouldn't be hearing from him. Tell me, please, who is the head of the GRU of the Russian General Staff? No one knows who he is. Why? Because that's classified information. But you hear Budanov everywhere. That's just not the way it should be. That's not the path of intelligence work. That is, they should be carrying out combat missions. Exactly. And by the way, why is it that the Russians have the GRU of the General Staff, the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff, while we have the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense? Do you think they have fools sitting over there? But here we've created a certain structure just to siphon off money and drift around aimlessly. That's what it's called. The GUR needs to be placed under the General Staff, under Hnatov at the moment. They'll quickly set them straight and assign them where they need to go and what needs to be done. It's the same situation with the security service, as I've already mentioned. Counterintelligence should be in the GUR and the General Staff, and everyone else should be lined up accordingly. The armed forces of Ukraine, what we don't need is political games in a democratic country. They run around with folders, making files on everyone who said what, who gave a dirty look to these office rats, and so on and so forth. So that's their problem. They've stepped into something that's not their business. That's the least of it. But as for North Korea, right now, concrete decisions need to be made. It's not far away, really not far at all. North Korea and Ukraine share a border. Don't be surprised now. The Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic borders North Korea along the Tonkaya and Tumanaya River, the Tumanaya River. That's why this issue needs to be addressed right there, where, for example, our intelligence services should be working specifically this issue, re-establishment of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic and engaging in combat operations with the North Korean donut along the Tumanaya River. That should be our objective. We'll see, because anything can happen. Just recently, the North Koreans had a ship fall in the wrong place. Well, ships don't just fall for no reason. That's something to think about too.
Dear audience, as always, please give this video a like. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as Ukraine itself. We work for an audience all over the world so that they know the truth about Russian aggression. That's why every like, every subscription, and every comment from you is priceless. I'll be grateful to you for all of that. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan, we work 3 times a week on my YouTube channel, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much. As usual, see you this Friday.